on the second day of class on January 15th, the Thursday, whatever that is when we come back. Bradley Thompson from Clemson will give a talk on America's revolutionary mind, leading into the semi-quincentennial. And we'll introduce our student constitutional fellow who will introduce tonight's speaker. Sophia Corin is a senior who is majoring in civil engineering, has done civil engineering internships the last 3 summers, and she's been a constitutional fellow and honor student, and done moot court, and next year she plans to go to law school. So, Sophia.
Thank you, Dr. Vance. Charles Rubin is a retired political philosophy professor from Duquesne University. Currently, he is working on a book exploring how classic stories about human-created monsters can shed light on the coming age of biotechnology. He has also written about AI, robots, and technologies, specifically the attempt to use these to redesign humanity. This topic he discusses in Eclipse of Man, Human Extinction and the Meaning of Progress. Dr. Rubin is also the author of The Green Crusade, Rethinking the Roots of Environmentalism, and editor of Conservation Reconsidered, Nature, Virtue, and American Liberal Democracy. He has twice been a visiting scholar for the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, as well as a fellow of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Additionally, he teaches for the Hudson Institute Political Studies Summer Program in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Rubin.
Thank you very much. I wasn't sure if I should come out from behind the curtain or not. I do want to thank Professor Vance, first of all, for inviting me here, for putting me in front of such a large group of also lively seeming students from the pre-talk chatter I was hearing. To be perfectly honest with you, I do kind of stand amazed here because your semester is almost over, right? I mean, and yet here you are. So thank you one and all for coming today, and thank you for inviting me. I don't think I'll be accused of exaggeration if I just begin by noting the extraordinary extent to which the rise of large language model artificial intelligence, and from now on I'll just say AI, has impacted the economy. In 2024, chipmaker NVIDIA accounted for 25% of the gains of the Standard & Poor Index. Morgan Stanley estimates that between now and 2028, there will be $3 trillion spent globally on data centers, capital spending driven largely, although not exclusively, by AI. And this impact, despite the fact that a number of studies have suggested that it is far from clear whether anybody is actually making any money from developing or implementing AI. Actually, I mean, it's actually perfectly clear that nobody's making any money yet from from developing AI. Maybe some companies are making some profits by implementing it. Meanwhile, the extent to which AI is eliminating jobs for people, or will begin to do so shortly, is hotly debated. Yet there are both advocates and critics of AI who agree that whatever we are seeing now is only the beginning of a kind of radical change to patterns of human work and investment that we can expect to see accelerating if we are going to be making progress towards the current holy grail of artificial general intelligence. LLMs have not only had impact on the tech sector or commerce generally, their consequences can also already be seen in education, with colleges and universities attempting, often in a rather half-hearted way in my opinion, to understand, adapt to, or contain their impact on higher education. Likewise, the popular and design arts are struggling to deal with this peculiar kind of creativity. You're going to be headed to law school. Somewhere along the line, they'll teach you don't use AI, except you'll find that if you do use AI and you bring it before a judge, probably the worst that will happen to you is a fine. And in a recent case, the judge even didn't bother fining the lawyers. He just reprimanded them in court. The tide may already be turning here. The fines were never very large, and one might wonder whether lawyers who tend to be rather thick-skinned anyway will continue to use even hallucinating AIs and tolerate the periodic chastisement that they might get if caught for the sake of saving their time and effort, or that of a paralegal they will no longer have to hire. For my part, I don't think developments like these come out of nowhere. Even before LLMs, for example, the legal profession was becoming increasingly automated by search tools and computer-generated material for routine or even customizable legal matters. Designers have long since switched from using manual drafting tools to computer programs that could speed up their work and supplement their skills. And most of the parts of most colleges and universities long since gave up on education in the classic formative sense of the liberal arts and adopted a model of training that is perfectly consistent with making sure that students are able to use whatever is the latest tool to advance the presumptively professional goals that buying their degree will allow them to pursue. I'm suggesting then that we need to be cautious about speaking of AI as revolutionary. It may indeed be bringing many changes, but these changes may themselves be long anticipated or consistent with pre-existing trends, beliefs, aspirations, customs, or norms. Whether AI is a bubble or an enduring transformative force, it has been able to spread like wildfire in our society because there is plenty of fuel already available on the ground in the way we think about the world and our place in it. Tonight, I want to illustrate what I take to be this general truth with a specific case. One of the things we are seeing with the rise of LLMs is a growing number of people who are engaged in one form or another of quasi-intimate relationships. I'm putting the word in quotes here and throughout this talk because maybe they shouldn't even be called relationships, but that's another matter. Anyway, with quasi-intimate relationships with chatbots. This is something that is covered heavily by the tech news sources that I follow, but it also has made its way into mainstream media. Let me just give you a few recent headlines to remind you of what you probably already know or have noticed yourself. First, people are starting to get divorced because of affairs with AI. Or again, people are having AI children with their AI partners. Or again, woman marries chatbot-generated groom through breach in the metaverse. Or Elon boasts that his AI can generate a beautiful woman saying, "I will always love you." Or again, Ohio seeks to ban AI-human marriage. Or is AI quietly replacing real friends? Study finds 72% of teens now treat chatbots like besties. Finally, mourning women say OpenAI killed their AI boyfriends, and so on. You're familiar with this already, right? This is not exactly news to you. Again, developments like this one have not, I think, come out of nowhere. Long before LLMs, people were, as they would say, falling in love with and wanting to marry, avatars, Japanese manga avatars. Efforts to make increasingly realistic sex spots have likewise been around for a long time. But more than that, the world of fiction and myth suggests a long-standing aspiration to the artificial creation of life and intelligence. Of course, most of these stories are cautionary tales, but their appeal over many centuries suggests that there is some broadly human aspiration to turn what is, after all, a biological commonplace into a technical marvel. One of the stories in this genre is the tale of Pygmalion from Ovid's Metamorphoses. How many of you have heard of the Pygmalion story already? And how many have seen My Fair Lady? Anybody? Yeah, okay. Or seen the Shaw play upon which that is based, maybe? Okay, not so many. So, you know, most of you look like you're familiar at least with the broad outlines of the story. A sculptor falls in love with a beautiful statue of his own creation and is gratified when Venus grants his wish to bring it to life. That summary I will suggest this afternoon is, to say the least, true but not exhaustive, as the saying goes. My thesis is that we can learn something of our own fascination with AI-generated love objects, of our own creation, by looking at the details of this story coming out of Ovid and the context in which Ovid places it in Metamorphoses. So, on to the story, but starting with the way it's placed in the Metamorphoses. First of all, it's part of a string of stories being told by Orpheus. And the topic of these stories is boys the gods have loved and girls incited by unlawful lust and passions who paid the penalty for their transgressions. So Orpheus tells a series of stories on this topic. As we will see in the story of Pygmalion, Ovid establishes a very literal connection between the stories of boys who gods have loved and girls incited by unlawful lust and passions. The tale of Pygmalion is further introduced by two immediately preceding stories that take place in the city of Amathus on Cyprus, an island beloved of Venus, we are told. The first story is of a horned race, the Cerastes, whose members violate the rules of hospitality by offering strangers as sacrifices. Venus, upset with this violation of the laws of hospitality, takes the suggestion from their horns and turns them all into bulls as punishment. The second story is about the daughters of Propetus, who deny outright the divinity of Venus. In punishment, she transforms them into the first prostitutes. As Ovid puts it, and when shame was gone and they could blush no more, they were transformed, the step was brief enough, into hard stones. So first into prostitutes, then into stones. Pygmalion's story follows these two, and it's thematically related, it seems to me, in two ways. The metamorphosis is reversed. Venus transforms something of ivory into flesh instead of from flesh into stone. But Pygmalion, we are told, creates his ivory girl. She is never named in Ovid, okay? Never given a name. In the first place, because he is disgusted by the many sins to which the female mind had been inclined by nature. It's thinking of the earlier two stories. given that both the Cerastes and the Propotes have been punished in an exemplary way, his conclusion would seem to be something of an overgeneralization. Are these two families typical of women generally? Seems unlikely, but Pygmalion decides that they reveal most clearly the sins to which the female mind is inclined by nature. Now, if Pygmalion were on the lookout for moral rectitude above all in a female of his own creation, it isn't immediately obvious why the ivory girl would have to be, as apparently she is, a picture of extraordinary beauty. Right? We are entitled to wonder whether Pygmalion does not confuse moral and physical qualities. The beautiful is not the same as the good when it comes to how people appear. Just cite the example of Proverbs 31. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain. All right? Pygmalion seems to think otherwise. Yet, if women are by their natures disgusting to Pygmalion, the only woman he can have has to be a product of art rather than nature. Again, notice, there's no real connection between or you wouldn't think, we'll get to this, you wouldn't think there's any connection between sculpting a beautiful statue and a morally righteous woman. But somehow these things are connected in Pygmalion's mind. And his success is amazing. Ovid says she's beautiful in a way that no woman who was born could ever match. And to look at her, even as a statue, you might think her alive, but just very still. With his art, he's hidden art, says Ovid. But of course, as a statue, the ivory girl has no moral qualities at all, and only the likeness of a body. As a statue, she is not really any different from the prostitutes turned into stone. Ovid seems to be well aware of this ambiguity about what exactly Pygmalion is trying to create, even if Pygmalion is not aware. In Ovid's telling, Pygmalion was sculpting his ideal of feminine physical beauty precisely for the sake of her physical beauty. In fact, Ovid goes on at some rather erotic length to describe the manner in which Pygmalion shows his love for the statue. It's not just that he adorns her with all kinds of gifts that young girls like. Ovid comments she's just as lovely unadorned. But Pygmalion certainly, to use our contemporary phrase, makes out with the statue. And indeed, he takes it into his bed, although Ovid is not explicit about whether any attempt at sexual activity takes place in that context. Okay. Comes a festival for Venus, and Pygmalion prays to her, timidly, Ovid comments, that she grant him a wife like my ivory girl, because Ovid says he's embarrassed to ask for what he really wants, which is for Venus to bring the ivory girl to life. Venus, however, knows what he wants and grants him his true wish. Slowly, again, forgive the indelicacy here, but slowly, while Pygmalion is fondling her, she warms up and comes to life. And Pygmalion exclaims, "She is a body!" So much for a deep concern with moral rectitude, right? The ivory girl, for her part, blushes, and opens her eyes for the first time to look up at the sky and see Pygmalion on top of her. 9 months later, still unnamed, but now Pygmalion's wife, she gives birth to a child, Paphos. And in a way, that's the end of the story. In his note to the Humphreys translation of Ovid, Joseph Reed comments on the happy ending, one of the few in Metamorphoses, despite the fact that he also notices Pygmalion's, quote, creepy treatment of the statue, and the fact that the enlivened ivory girl is a kind of Stepford wife with no mind within that the reader can discern. Indeed so. And if you don't know the novel or the movie Stepford Wives, it's really not so much worth knowing, but you can Google it, right? However, in fact, this is not the end of the story. It's certainly not the end of the Orpheus cycle. For Paphos has a son, Cinyras, who somehow becomes a king in the east. Cinyras has a daughter, Myrrha, who is thus the great-granddaughter of Pygmalion and the Ivory Girl. Dissatisfied with suitors that are coming to her from all over the Orient, she conceives a passion, again, forgive me, for her father. And while she knows it's wrong and makes some effort to resist it in a long dialogue with herself, she also offers a very spirited intellectual defense of the naturalness of incest. With the help of her old nurse, who takes pity on her unhappy charge when she sees Myrrha attempting suicide, she eventually sleeps with her father twice during a festival for Ceres when Cinyras cannot sleep with his wife. But when the second time her father cannot restrain his curiosity about who this lovely young woman is that he's sleeping with, her secret is revealed, and he tries to kill her. She has to flee. Myrrha escapes into a kind of wandering exile, and 9 months later, heavily pregnant from her father and overwhelmed by shame, she begs any god listening, right? She puts out a general call to Olympus. Any god listening, transform her in some way and deny her life and death. Some god, again unspecified, responds, and she's transformed into a tree, which later gives birth to the beautiful Adonis, for whom Venus famously conceived a great, if accidental, and ultimately thwarted passion. Against Venus's advice, Adonis goes hunting and is killed by a boar. Venus transforms him into the anemone, born of the wind. Those Venus would punish, she turns into stone. Those she would reward, she makes ephemeral. And that, so far as I can tell, is the end of the line of Pygmalion, just as it is the end of the Orpheus stories. Now, clearly, there's a genealogical link between the Pygmalion story and the Myrrha story, right? I don't think it's accidental that she is Pygmalion's granddaughter. But there is another nice little link between the two stories. For when her father notices that Myrrha is pining away with what is actually love for him, he assumes it's because of the fact that, she has not yet married. She hasn't found a suitable husband. So looking for guidance, he asks her what kind of man she's looking for. "A man like you," she replies. Okay? Just as Pygmalion wanted a wife like the ivory girl. Venus can understand his deception. Mira's father can't understand what she means when she says, "A man like you." All right. What do we make of this cycle of stories? For us, I think it's not necessarily very hard to sum it up in the now infamous saying, "The heart wants what the heart wants." But they also raise the question of whether what the heart wants should have the only, or indeed maybe just even the final say. Let's start with "the heart wants what the heart wants." Metamorphoses taken as a whole is a lesson in the absolute omnivorousness of erotic desire. It turns out the heart can want all kinds of bizarre things. Sometimes this occurs within mortals, sometimes within the very human Greek gods. But the range of eros, the range of desire, is huge. If, as in the preface to the Pygmalion story, men can gain erotic satisfaction from what Ovid says are heartless prostitutes, then already it is not so big a step to Pygmalion having physical relations with a beautiful statue, however non-responsive she might be. But why Pygmalion chooses that kind of relationship is, as we've already begun to see, complicated. He's shocked by the example of the Propotides and the vices that they exhibit, which he takes to be vices given to women by nature generally. But what those vices are, in the case of the Propotides at least, is not that clear. The other family, okay, they violate the laws of hospitality. The Propotides, their immediate problem is that they deny the divinity of Venus. Is that the vice that Pygmalion is concerned about? Is he a deep believer in the traditional gods and he's offended by anyone who would deny the divinity of Venus? Does he believe that women are more likely to be, atheists than men? Perhaps he's disgusted by their life after they've been turned into prostitutes, by their cold-hearted natures, having sex for money. But they only live that life as Venus's punishment for the impiety. So again, is it this particular form of impiety that is of greatest concern to him? Perhaps we are to understand that in this case the punishment fits the crime, and that only the cold-hearted would deny the divinity of Venus in the first place. And this would be his concern, the cold-heartedness of women. Again, so he makes a statue and makes out with a statue, right? Something isn't quite clicking in his head. The ivory girl is more heartless as a statue than the most heartless prostitute. He comes to want more than the statue only because his eros is aroused by the statue in the first place. And indeed, he has designed the statue for that to be true. Right? He sets out to make a woman who is erotically appealing to him. Why prefer her to a prostitute? Is it because there's no pretense of passion on her side? Is it because he doesn't have to pay her? Is it that he can have an exclusive relationship with her? Is it because she can't blaspheme because she's a statue? None of these possibilities speak well for the supposed moral impulse that he has in creating the ivory girl in the first place. Even if he comes to want more, in some fashion, her initial insensibility is attractive to him. But if he wants her to be alive, he must believe that alive she will not have the vices of real women. It's not obvious why that would be the case. Again, he could just be confusing physical beauty with moral rectitude. But then which is more important to him? We can begin to answer that question if we note that the reality he desires from her seems limited to wanting her to have a flesh and blood body, nothing more. Again, he doesn't even want to name her. He doesn't want witty conversation. He doesn't want emotional support. Doesn't want good cooking. He doesn't seem to want anything that, normally we might think would make for a nice relationship between two real human beings. And we hear nothing about how she comes to love him. We hear nothing of a common life together, raising their child. Nothing of how she is educated. For that, we have to turn to George Bernard Shaw. Nothing of what kind of woman the ivory girl develops into. Nothing of how he responds to the presumably aging body of his once perfect statue. What Pygmalion's heart wants actually turns out to be very minimal. His delight in her becoming sexually responsive to him is, for all intents and purposes, the whole story. Now, Ovid will not be the last author to wonder whether or to what extent unmediated male erotic desire in particular is directed to anything beyond self-gratification. Not trying to do male shaming here, but this is, a major theme of literature going way back and coming right down to the present day. But, Ovid also makes clear that erotic desire can be equally powerful in females through the story of Mira. This is all the more reason to note the historical fact, as it seems to me anyway, that directing and taming Eros, particularly among boys and men, but not exclusively, has been regarded as one of the central tasks of any polity, culture, society, or human association. Although there's certainly no agreement in theory with Socrates' account of the soul, the tripartite soul in the Republic, I would claim that the vast majority of societies have acted as if it were true in practice, that the hydra of Eros must be tamed by a cooperative effort between our intelligence and our thumos. To put it another way, Eros that is not sublimated in some way, turned towards family, towards chivalry, towards romance, toward conquest, towards religion, towards philosophy, is likely to be very troublesome. Now, it may seem as if this is overreading a very short and, rather modest little story. It hardly seems to matter very much if a lonely sculptor falls in love with his own creation and prays successfully to have it brought to some kind of life. But I don't think Ovid wants to let Pygmalion off quite so simply. The links between him and his great-granddaughter Mira should give us pause. She is at least self-conscious and torn about her incestuous desire. But there is a very powerful part of her that thinks that it is literally only natural that her love for her father should culminate in a sexual relationship. Part of her argument with herself can be summarized by a convenient misuse of a classic line from Cole Porter: "Birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it. Let's do it, let's fall in love." But it seems as if even so, Mira might not have acted on her desire, not because she decides it's wrong, but because she has no plan how to accomplish it. It is her old nurse who comes up with the plan. In Ovid, as in Shakespeare, old nurses are to be carefully monitored. Why would the old nurse do such a terrible thing for the most innocent sounding of reasons? She only wants to see the suicidal Mira happy. And why should anything stand in the way of anyone's happiness if what they want is only doing what comes naturally? Now, in the strictest sense, Pygmalion is not engaged in an incestuous relationship with the ivory girl, but I think it is actually an incest adjacent. He is, after all, her progenitor, having given her form and provided the impetus for her coming to life. She is a manifest image of his vision of beauty. The extent of his control over her coming into being makes him even more responsible for her than a biological father is for his biological daughter. Does the lack of natural or biological relationship in and of itself justify the startling lack of introspection he shows about his own hardly conventional desires in comparison with Mira? Again, she's at least torn. He's not torn. He'll make out with a statue. Great. And he does not even have nature on his side. As we have seen, the whole point of the ivory girl is that she is, as it were, an unnatural woman. The strongest point of contact between Pygmalion and Mira would seem to be eros that takes the form of love of one's own. The love of one's own is a pervasive aspect of human behavior, manifesting in everything from love of family to love of country, and every scale of association in between. It is by no means necessarily a bad thing, but it certainly can manifest in bad ways at any of these levels. It is subject both to excess and defect. For all I know, it is not uncommon for sculptors to be in some sense enamored with their own work. That much love of one's own hardly seems inordinate, given the time and psychic effort and physical effort required to engage in the work. But that's not Pygmalion's story. He doesn't happen to fall in love with a sculpture he's making. He makes a sculpture in order to fall in love with it, out of a principled rejection of relationships with real women. Love of one's own in a sexual or romantic or marital relation is already quite narrow and subject to excesses, like incest, that can be created by that narrow focus. But some of these excesses tend to be moderated by the fact that one is tied to the will and the desires of another real human being. Right? In his relationship with the ivory girl, Pygmalion focuses entirely on his own will and desire. He wants her to have a body, yes. He wants it to be a responsive body, yes. But he doesn't care what she's thinking. He doesn't care what she wants, what she doesn't want, right? You know, she doesn't come alive and he says, oh, I'm so pleased to meet you, you know, let's go out on a date. You know, the first thing she's aware of is he's on top of her. I mean, there's no reciprocity here. He doesn't want to woo and win her, right? He doesn't want any kind of genuine relationship. So, can we learn anything from this about AI today? Let me be direct. I do not think that there's a substantive difference between Pygmalion and those today who are forming what they think of as relationships with chatbots, avatars, and or sexbots. In some way, we will find, I think, the same kind of underlying moral objection to normal relationships, the same misdirection of eros to the narrowest form of love of one's own, that is to say, love of oneself. Just as Pygmalion can seemingly be happy with his ivory girl in statue or fleshly form, so too these so-called relationships may conduce to the happiness, in some sense of that term, to those who engage in them. But that is not the same thing as saying that there are no negative downstream consequences of this misdirected eros. For example, there can hardly fail to be consequences if Eros is even more decoupled from child rearing than it already is. I mean, it is, to an unprecedented degree today. But it could be worse, and AI makes it worse. Because at least if you're in a relationship with another human being, right, you may find that circumstances change and you didn't think you wanted children, but now you want children. This is not that unusual, and that isn't going to be possible with an AI who is always basically just reflecting back to you your own desires. There are already signs, another consequence that we can expect, that erotic relations that are illicit, illegal, or impossible in the real world will flourish in virtual contexts. And I suspect that in some of those cases, there will be pressures to be, quote, inclusive or, quote, non-discriminatory when those relations bleed over into public contexts. And third, if one is worried already about Tocquevillian individualism in our society, then imagine a world where you don't actually have to have any relationships with any human beings at all. You can just gather with any collection of chatbots that you have put together and withdraw entirely from reality. Nevertheless, let me conclude by dealing with a couple of aspects of the current situation that would seem at first to be significantly different from the Pygmalion story. When Pygmalion sculpts his own companion, the fact that he makes it from head to toe is significant, and today very few people are programming their own relationship partners from start to finish. They come not from the individual creativity and the skill of the user, but from the stream of commercially available products developed by teams that may or may not have any interest in how their product is employed, except to the extent that it can be sold to as many people as possible. One is, in a manner of speaking, buying love, which is perhaps just what Pygmalion objected to. To that extent, our current situation adds another problematic layer to the Pygmalion story. But I would suggest that part of this, at any rate, is just a transitional phase. Already, these bots are highly customizable, right? And over time, the fusing of the visual and the auditory and text, you'll be able to talk with exactly the person you want to talk with and have the responses that will be most gratifying to you. A more serious disjunction may be that it appears for many who engage in a relationship with chatbots that the non-physical aspect of the partner seems to be satisfying and perhaps even optimal. Right? These are people who don't necessarily want any kind of physical relationship. Now, I expect that in the not-too-distant future, more people will want more visual cues, get beyond text interfaces. It would surprise me that within a decade there were not customizable services available to embody a previously virtual companion, with such robotic avatars coming increasingly realistic over time. Nevertheless, it's also possible that an entirely virtual girlfriend or boyfriend may satisfy many who exhibit this preference in the first place. For them, the lack of physicality will be a feature and not a bug, because actual relationships involving real bodies, right? It's embarrassing. It's awkward. All kinds of things can happen by accident. And just a moment's wrong move and the ick factor comes in and you're done, right? Our embodiment is something that we have to overcome to some degree in real relationships. So if you don't want to make that effort, or if you are just too so much uncomfortable in your own body that you can't imagine being a body with someone else, then an entirely virtual girlfriend or boyfriend could be a huge advantage. This apparent difference may actually point, however, to an underlying similarity. To To the extent that Pygmalion initially falls in love with a statue who he can adorn to his own taste, he can avoid all of these messy vagaries, embarrassments, and inconveniences that come along with a relationship with an actual human being. As a statue, the ivory girl will never reject his advances or his gifts. The same may be true of the ivory girl even after she has a body. A disembodied romantic partner programmed to play into the desires of the human user will share that advantage. In a relationship between real people, even when both people are joyously cooperating to achieve the same end, human limits mean that there is always some irreducible otherness about the other. To love the other and to maintain a relationship in the face of this inevitable resistance is to extend a circle of sympathy and understanding that moves us beyond the narrowest love of one's own, that is to say, love of oneself. My guess is that this process of maturation is very much what virtual relationships short-circuit, and even in some cases may be intended to short-circuit. Those who substitute such relationships for real relationships therefore risk a kind of perpetual emotional immaturity, even as they may seek out such supposed partners out of a certain emotional immaturity. All right, conclusion. We live in a technological age, and even when it comes to defining problems or solutions, we see them through that lens. I'm suggesting this afternoon, however, that the developing trend towards seeking relationships with AI in one form or another is not only, and perhaps not even primarily, a technological problem. The latest technology is being caught up in a very old challenge that perhaps our technological predisposition, along with other cultural trends, makes it hard to take seriously. If we rest content with believing that the heart wants what the heart wants, and nothing more can or should be said, which I think is pretty much where, broadly speaking, the culture is, our Western culture is today, then AI will be there to facilitate in ever more sophisticated ways, ever more Pygmalions. That development will likely be hailed by many as a great liberation from constraints that both nature and convention have put on how our eros is directed. My own judgment is that the result will not conduce to the well-being of individuals or of our society or of our politics, although this may be an occasion for some to claim, as indeed already is happening, that we really can do without both society and politics in the name of the liberation of individual desire. In contrast, I'm inclined to think that insofar as we remain human, that is to say, political animals with a capacity for speech and reason, we cannot give up so quickly on the old effort to direct and contain the erotic part of our soul in such a way as we can live in some kind of peace and happiness with ourselves and our fellows. My own generation experienced the sometimes good, but more often terrible consequences of thinking that the world could be rebuilt on the great principle of if it feels good, do it. That's the wisdom of the 60s in a nutshell. It may be that the very worst outcome possible today is that now AI relationships will make it possible for each of us to feel good with far fewer obvious costs to those around us. We will, as political commentator Bruno Macias has already explicitly advocated, be able to live in our own private virtual worlds with whatever sort of ivory girl or ivory boy we desire, worlds that run according to the way we think the world should be run. In these worlds, we will all have some God to transform us when and how we wish. For me, this is one of those utopian visions that is so obviously dystopian that it is hard to understand how it could ever be sought after. But we may well be in a world where we get more and more AI, which allows us to follow more and more the dictates of unmediated eros. Thank you.
All right. Time for some questions. Maybe I'll start with one myself, if view, you sort of suggested at the end there that you don't understand how this kind of utopian vision could be anything other than dystopian. I'm sort of I guess I'm sort of thinking that through a lot of your talk, like what is your account of how this seems utopian or appears to be utopian to some people? Is it just that there's no better alternative to kind of intense loneliness or something
Yeah,
like that?
I think we are living in a time where lots of people have a fairly superficial understanding of their own humanity, right? And that understanding revolves around seeking the maximum liberation of desire. Right? Why do you want to become rich? You want to become rich because you want to do great acts of charity? Well, you'll do that, but you really want to become rich because you want to be able to do whatever you want to do when you want to do it, right? And that model of a good life becomes, in some sense, a model for many, many, many people. I want to grow up to be middle class and experience the constraints of making a budget. That's not what we're sold. That's not why there are TV programs that feature incredibly wealthy housewives and stars and famous people who can do whatever they want to do. So, we have all kinds of bad models in front of us. We have a shallow understanding of who we are and what we are all about. And so when something comes along that looks like, wow, I can have the kind of relationship I want to have, right? When I want to have it. My chatbot is never going to call me in the middle of the night, and ask for emotional support, unless I program such a call because I want to be, hopeful and kind. But it's just what I want is the primary thing. You want to blame boomers for something? That's
Yes.
what you blame boomers for.
Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for your talk. I'm still kind of formulating this question, so if you could bear with me. I think I've found that in fairy tales, specifically, which are told to children, what is true and good is most oftentimes also physically beautiful. And I think as well in these fairy tales, you have beautiful ideals set for both men and women. So I'm wondering, with the rise of AI and in this Ovid example that you presented, you have this perversion of what is good and what is beautiful because I'm just feeding my own ideas back to myself. So I'm wondering, how do you see in our modern society these ideas of what is truly good and truly beautiful? How do you see that, or even affecting just gender norms? Because if you have men and women creating these customizable chatbots, right, then my idea of who an ideal man is going to be different from what that actually is. So how do you see that changing our ideas of what is truly beautiful and also these ideals that we should have for ourselves?